Hi, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Michaela Zerkes. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Executive Director with Brooklyn for Peace. We'd like to begin by taking a moment to acknowledge that here in Brooklyn, we are on the seized and occupied territory of the Lenape people, who took care of this land for generations before they were removed by genocidal violence. So wherever we are, I invite us to pay our respects to those who came before us, their elders past and present, and consider the legacies of displacement, migration, and settlement that enable us to be here today. Let's also please take a brief moment of silence to honor the many lives lost in the last few years due to COVID-19, police violence, poverty, racism, the climate crisis, and so much more. Thank you. So for folks who aren't already familiar with Brooklyn for Peace, we have been working in Brooklyn since 1984. Our core mission is the prevention of war and the social, racial, environmental, and economic injustices which lead to war and are also the products of war. We are primarily an educational organization, and we see active response to injustice as a vital component of our activities. If you're not already a member of Brooklyn for Peace, please go to our website, brooklynpeace.org, and join us. A basic membership is $35 annually or whatever you can afford. All donations are tax deductible, and a donation of any size will be greatly appreciated as it enables us to continue doing programs like this one. And the links for donations will be in the chat. We'd also like to thank our co-sponsoring organizations for joining us and for helping to publicize tonight's event. And before we get started, I'll just mention that this event is being recorded and will be available to view on our YouTube channel afterwards. And I'd like to ask that folks keep your microphones on mute during the program, and please type any questions and comments you have into the chat. And then we'll take those questions after our speaker has finished her initial remarks. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight's forum. Medea Benjamin is the co-founder of the women-led peace group Code Pink. She is also co-founder of the human rights group Global Exchange, the Peace in Ukraine Coalition, Unfreeze Afghanistan, the Alliance for Cuba Engagement and Respect, and the Nobel Peace Prize for Cuban Doctors campaign. Medea has been an advocate for social justice for 50 years. Described as one of America's most committed and most effective fighters for human rights by New York Newsday, and one of the high-profile leaders of the peace movement by the Los Angeles Times. She was one of 1,000 exemplary women from 140 countries nominated to receive the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of the millions of women who do the essential work of peace worldwide. So thank you for joining us tonight, Medea, and now we'll hand the program off to you.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be with you. I'm such a fan of Brooklyn for Peace. It's like you're a national organization. You have the greatest events and you have a fabulous community, and I'm really very privileged to be able to share this time with you. I want to start by acknowledging what I assume brings us all together here, which is our opposition to war, and acknowledge our heartbreak at all the Ukrainians who have been killed during this almost one-year conflict now, the Ukrainians and the Russian soldiers who have been killed, most of them young men, many of them conscripted, not wanting to fight, all of the millions of refugees who have had to flee their homes. It is heartbreaking to see what devastation war brings, and that's why we are people who are committed to trying to stop wars, whoever the aggressor is, wherever those wars are happening. I know that all of you have a different level of understanding about this war, and many of you have been very avidly following the news, and others perhaps not so much. So I'll go through some of the background quickly so that we can talk about what's happening right now. But first, let me say that the news this week of the transfer of tanks, both from Germany and other European countries, as well as from the United States, is just more notch in the escalation of this war. And as soon as that announcement was made, Zelensky has upped the ante again by saying, well, now we need jet fighters. So our big question is, where is this going? In terms of understanding the context, I hear many people dismiss the idea that the expansion of NATO had anything to do with this conflict. And I find that quite alarming because it doesn't take into account all of the warnings that had been made from the time that the expansion began. We know in 1991, with the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the promises that were made to Gorbachev not to expand NATO 1 inch eastward. And then as Democrat and Republican presidents, Clinton, Bush, violated that agreement, we heard more and more coming out from academics, diplomats, policy experts from the US and all over Europe saying this is a terrible mistake. There is no reason for this expansion. This will create instability in the region, and we will see a blowback from this on the part of Russia. So it was in many ways a war foretold. The other issue I think that many Americans don't understand is that NATO is not a defensive organization. NATO is an aggressive, dangerous military alliance. Not only has it been involved in bombing campaigns in Europe, as in the case of Kosovo, but it has gone far beyond North America to be engaged in invasions, occupations in places like Afghanistan and Libya. And just like the United States, NATO now talks about China as its greatest adversary and is already, while engaged in this conflict in Ukraine, looking towards Asia and China as a potential place for the next war. And so when we hear about NATO being a defensive organization, that Russia should not have been so concerned about the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO, I think we should explain to people how wrong that is and how the United States would never allow something similar if there were an aggressive anti-US military alliance on our border, say in Mexico. The US would probably long ago have been going to war to stop that from happening. The other issue is about US intervention in Ukraine, which is very intense. You can look at what the Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, said back in 2013, that the US taxpayer had given billions of dollars to Ukraine through the National Endowment for Democracy, building up what were essentially anti-Russian organizations. And then came the 2014 Maidan uprising, where the US became intimately involved in an uprising that was initially a popular opposition against a democratically elected but corrupt government, and turned into a very ugly military or violent conflict. We know, thanks to the leaked audio tape from Victoria Nuland herself to the US ambassador in Ukraine at the time, how the US had machinations to actually decide who would be the next person in power in Ukraine and who would be sidelined and made to work from the outside. This extraordinary level of intervention is something that must be understood. And then right after that, the conflict that erupted in the Donbass and the Russian takeover of Crimea led to what was essentially a civil war in the Donbass. And in an effort to quell the conflict in the Donbass, there were the Minsk agreements that was signed in 2015. Well, today, from recent interviews that we have read with the head of Germany at the time, Angela Merkel, and the head of France at the time, Francois Hollande, saying that the Minsk agreements, which Russia assumed were to end the conflict, were actually to buy time for Ukraine to build up its military, for the West to train the military, and to arm the military. And that certainly was done. As soon as the Minsk agreements were signed, the weapons started flowing in. So we have a situation where the Russians have no sense of trust in terms of an agreement that was signed back in 2015, and the political part of that agreement was never implemented, meaning that Donbass was never given the autonomy that the agreement said that it would have. And we have the constant buildup and the involvement of NATO in Ukraine, the promise to let NATO into Ukraine. But even while that didn't happen, there were NATO military exercises that Ukraine was part of. And in many ways, Ukraine was incorporated into the NATO sphere. So then if we fast forward to the time of the Russian invasion almost a year ago, we can say that this was a provoked invasion, but not a justified invasion. And I think that's very important to be clear about. It was a violation of the UN Charter. It was a violation of the Kelambri Act. It's a violation of the sovereignty of Ukraine. And this brutal war is one that we have no idea where it's going. And that's the next point I want to make, because I think it is clear that there is no such thing as victory. First of all, what does victory mean? Some talk about victory as getting the Russians back to where they were before the February 24th invasion, but others say it's going back to 2014, pushing Russia out of the Donbass completely and retaking Crimea. This is the position that Zelensky holds right now. But many people in military officialdom in the United States, as well as in Europe, have been saying, sometimes openly and oftentimes behind the scenes, that this is just not possible. We had the words of the chair of the Joint Chief of Staff, Mark Milley, who said that a military victory on the battlefield was very unlikely and called on Ukraine to seize the moment and go for negotiations. We have generals in Europe who have been saying very much the same thing, in fact, even stronger, saying that it is not possible for Ukraine to take back Crimea without terrible consequences. And now that we have read in the New York Times recently that Biden is warming up to the idea of the US helping Ukraine bring this conflict into Crimea itself, I want to read the words of a brigadier general from Germany who was Angela Merkel's top military advisor from 2006 to 2013. He said, "The region of Crimea is as important to the Russians and their Black Sea fleet as the Caribbean or Panama is to the United States, or the South China Sea is to China. For strategic reasons, the Russians cannot get out of there. If they were forced to pull out of the Black Sea region by massive Western intervention, they would certainly resort to nuclear weapons." I think that is a very profound statement that we should think about, because where is this conflict going? We heard Biden himself mention the possibility of nuclear Armageddon. But yet we hear many Westerners being very blasé about that, saying Putin would never use a nuclear weapon. There's really no chance of a nuclear war. On the other hand, they talk about Putin as being so crazy, so unpredictable, so irrational, and yet that he wouldn't use a nuclear weapon. I think when we see the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists move the doomsday clock to 90 seconds before midnight, that should give us great pause about the real potential of a nuclear war. The other is the potential of this extending beyond Ukraine and even Russia, because there are attacks inside Russia now. And that is the possibility, either by design or by mistake, of a missile going into a place like Poland, which almost happened recently. Thank goodness it was a Ukrainian missile and not a Russian one. But that would invoke Article 5 of NATO, which says that an attack on one is an attack on all, and that would lead to direct NATO involvement in the war. In the best case scenario, we see an endless war, which is meaning that Ukraine gets entirely devastated, town after town, city after city. So isn't the best possibility one of negotiations? Well, people say you can't negotiate with Russia. There is obviously very little trust on both sides, but I think there are examples of Ukraine and Russia already talking to each other on certain issues. For example, there have been, with the thanks of Erdogan in Turkey, negotiations to get the grain, tens of millions of tons of grain, out of Ukraine and into the market where it has been so needed. There has been negotiations to get the fertilizers out of Russia, despite sanctions that were holding back the sale of those fertilizers. There have been negotiations to stop the shelling at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, the largest nuclear plant in Europe, when it looked like that plant was about to blow up, and instead get representatives of the International Atomic Energy Association into the plants. And there have been numerous prisoner exchanges. We in the West hear about the exchange between Russia and the US with Brittany Griner, but what we don't hear about are the exchanges that are happening, I would say, probably twice a month, in which sometimes it's hundreds of prisoners are being swapped. And just think about the kind of negotiations that's necessary to decide how many prisoners, which prisoners, the logistics of it, the trust that is needed to make sure that each side is going to comply with what it said. So there are some negotiations that are happening. We also know that early on in this war, in March and early April, there were very positive results of negotiations that were happening thanks to the mediation of Turkey that came up with a 15-point plan to end the conflict. Unfortunately, the head of the UK at that time, Boris Johnson, and later Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, intervened and basically said to Zelensky that we will not support these negotiations, but we will support you to keep the fight up. And suddenly the negotiations ended, and indeed, the fight has been going on with no negotiations on these larger issues. I think it's useful to think about the war in Ukraine on two levels. One, that it's a civil conflict inside Ukraine that the Russians got involved in, and therefore there need to be talks between Russia and Ukraine, but also that it's a geopolitical war that has also turned into a proxy war between the United States/NATO and Russia. And on that level, there need to be direct discussions between the US and Russia. And it is quite remarkable that given this is going on for almost a year, there have been no direct talks between Biden and Putin. There have been no direct talks between Blinken, who is the Secretary of State, the #1 diplomat in this country. You wouldn't know it. You would think he works for the Pentagon, because he hasn't been talking to his counterpart in Russia. What are the things that they need to talk about? Well, they need to talk about things like the national security guarantees that Russia would need. They need to talk about what would Russia have to do to get sanctions lifted? What are the possibilities of negotiating a reduction of the 100,000 US troops that are in Europe? What about the bases that Europe has in Romania and Poland, just 100 miles from Russia's border? Arms control negotiations, negotiations to try to stop both sides from modernizing their nuclear weapons, going back to treaties that the US pulled out of, like the Open Skies, perhaps going back to talk about the possibility of US removing its nuclear weapons from the 5 countries in Europe where they are stationed. That's Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Turkey. So there is a lot to talk about. But at this point, we don't have a Congress that is pushing for talks. What we have a Congress that is just rubber stamping and even increasing a blank check that has given over $100 billion in less than 1 year to this war. We see in Congress that the only ones who are questioning this war now are Republicans, particularly on the extreme right. And yet, in the Democratic Party, when there were 30 Democrats from the Progressive Caucus that signed on to a letter not calling for an end to the weapons, but saying, in addition to that, there should be negotiations, they got so much pushback from other members of the Democratic Party, as well as individuals who had signed that letter earlier on, that within 24 hours, the letter was rescinded. And now there is only one member of that original 30 group, that's Ro Khanna from California, that has continued to say that negotiations is, of course, a rational thing to be calling for. And he has gotten a lot of positive feedback when he went on CNN saying that. And it is, to me, it is strange that none of the other Democrats have been willing to go back to their original position. And given that you all have such important people in your district, like Yvette Clarke, who was one of the original signers of that letter, and of course, Hakeem Jeffries, who is so critical in the House right now, it's so important that we talk about how are we going to build up the momentum so that these people in Congress, especially the progressive Democrats, start to do the kind of questioning that those on the extreme right are doing. Start to say no blank check for Ukraine. Start to ask where all this money has gone. Start to call for accountability, but most importantly, start to call for a ceasefire and negotiations. And that's why I am so delighted to be with you tonight. And I look forward to discussion about how we can be more effective on the grassroots level about creating that groundswell of support for negotiations to take this war from the battlefield to the peace table. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Medea. We have, as you might expect, quite a few questions, more than we'll have time to get to. So I may try to consolidate a few of the questions together. The one question that a couple of people have asked who are somewhat critical here is, and these are two different versions of it. One is, what will happen to Ukraine if there is no military aid? Is it possible to negotiate with Kremlin, and to what outcome? I think you probably answered the second half of that. And also, how to stop Russia from committing genocide of Ukrainian people and destroying civilian infrastructure.
I think that the constant flow of so many weapons is a disincentive to negotiate. There are already so many weapons in Ukraine. And, at one point, the Ukrainians were saying that they were getting their weapons from the retreating troops of Russia. Certainly, the Ukrainians have the right to defend themselves, but we don't have to have a blank check for weapons. And especially when there is no simultaneously call for negotiations. I feel that if we continue on this route, we will be in the midst of the war directly. The next call is for fighter jets. There have been calls for the West and the US to actually clear the skies. That would mean, as it was proposed early on, US shooting down Russian pilots. There is no end to what Zelensky will ask for, and that's totally understandable. But there has to be some point at which we say, this is just going into a wider conflict, and more Ukrainians are being killed. I think the way to stop the slaughter is to call for negotiations. And when we talk about the self-determination of the Ukrainian people, I think that's absolutely critical. But let's remember self-determination also for the people of Donbass and the people of Crimea. And they need to stop being killed as well.
Okay, thank you. Another question goes back to the Minsk Accords. Let me see if I can find it. Bear with me a second. Here, and that's, why didn't Ukraine allow the referendums in the Minsk agreements? Was it like the US and Vietnam, where the US knew their side would lose?
Well, that's a very good question. And so according to the Minsk agreement, 30 days after it was signed, Parliament was supposed to pass a law authorizing elections, which it never did. They were supposed to grant Donbass an autonomous status by 2015, which they never did. And we see that the heads of state of Ukraine, whenever they wanted to implement the peace accord, were threatened by the right, the neo-Nazis, like Zelensky was when he ran as a peace president who was going to go meet with the representatives of the breakaway republics, was going to implement the Minsk Accords. When he tried to do that, he was threatened that he would be hanging from a tree. So I think the ultra-right had a lot to do with the accords not being implemented. And the other thing is that France and Germany, who were supposed to be party to these accords, as well as the US, didn't do anything to push Ukraine to implement the political aspects of that agreement.
Okay, these are two related, they're comments, I guess, but they probably want you to comment on them. One says the US economy and capitals needs war by design, and another says the US is addicted to war. Perhaps we can target some of the, quote, defense companies.
Yes, I think in a group like this, we understand how we have allowed our country to become one that is so much based on a war economy, so much based on the manufacture of weapons and the sale or giveaway of these weapons around the world, so much based on a fossil fuel industry. And this is a major impediment when we try to stop war. We've seen that the humongous Pentagon budget that has just passed, $858 billion, does not even include all of the money that goes for the modernization of our nuclear weapons, for the Veterans Affairs, and for Ukraine, which is a separate pot of money. So you put that all together, and it's now $1 trillion. It is really something that keeps us from having a robust foreign policy that is based on diplomacy. You look at somebody like Anthony Blinken, he comes from a lobby group that was invested in getting major contracts for the Pentagon. He, instead of talking about peace negotiations, has been traveling around the world, strong-arming countries, first in Europe and now even in Latin America and in Israel, for them to send weapons to Ukraine. So we're in a very tough spot. And I think this particular war, where Russia is more of the aggressor, it gives a positive hue to these military companies that before were starting to worry about their reputation because of the losing wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but now they're seen as the defenders of democracy. And so it's very important that we convey to people how the idea that the US is a defender of democracy against autocracy or dictatorships around the world is really belied when you look at where our weapons are going, at the fact that we have been selling billions and billions of dollars of weapons to the repressive government of Saudi Arabia while it's been killing people in Yemen for 8 years now, while we give almost $4 billion of our tax dollars to Israel every year while it attacks the Palestinians. We give almost $2 billion and mostly in weapons to the repressive government of Egypt. So it is not like the United States has been using its oversized weapons industry and Pentagon budget to support democracy around the world. It really is the contrary. And we see the effects back home when we have the militarized police forces, the militarized border, and the violence that is really a blowback or goes hand in hand with the violence of our foreign policy.
Okay, this is a kind of a long question, but it's straightforward. Thank you for your work and clear presentation. Many traditionally anti-war folks among friends are staying aloof from this issue because of their distress over Russian behavior in Ukraine. When peace groups say things like President Biden is a warmonger or holds events that ignore Russian aggression, adds to that problem. What are your thoughts about peace groups that fail to recognize Russian aggression as a feature of this situation?
I think that's a problem for us. I think we have to start from saying that the Russian aggression is unjustified, that it's brutal, that it must be ended. I think we have to support the courageous people in Russia who are standing up against this war. Many of them have gone to jail. Many of them have fled the country and need help in the diaspora. I think that were I a Russian, I would be in prison right now for protesting this war. I don't think that we can call ourselves a peace movement or an anti-war movement or peace people or anti-war people unless we are against war, period.
Okay, a number of people have asked questions about energy, some about the fossil fuel companies, but also one person said, how come no one is talking about all the energy reserves in the Crimean Sea? It's a lot.
Well, yes, there is certainly an issue about resources, about energy, about agricultural land and grains, all kinds of rich resources that this part of the world contains. And then in terms of the energy companies, it is quite remarkable how much the US oil and gas companies have quickly thrown themselves into the mix to be selling their dirty energy to Europe to replace the energy that has been sanctioned from Russia, and oftentimes at about 4 times the price that we are paying for it here at home. And so there is a lot of complaining in Europe about the war profiteering of US energy companies right now. There are a lot of issues related to energy and environment that people should be aware of and be able to talk to those in the environmental movement that have not paid attention to this war or think that it's good to keep the flow of weapons into the region. And that is, there's many connections to be made. One is that the blowing up of that Nord Stream pipeline led to the largest emissions of methane that have ever been recorded, according to the UN Environmental Program. Another is the devastation of Ukraine's environment from this war, the devastation of all of the weapons that are being produced. Just think about the Abrams tanks that are run with that have jet engines that get about 3 miles to a gallon. Just think of all the energy in the production and the use of these weapons. And then also think of all of the money, over $100 billion that we have spent on this war just in less than a year, and how that could go to dealing with the climate crisis. So there are many connections that we should be making.
Okay, this question asks, why don't we hear from Ukrainians at peace rallies? Is there a Ukrainian left?
Well, there are Ukrainians inside Ukraine who are pacifists, who are against the war. Some of them are still working openly, and others of them who were supposed to be recruited into the military are in jail, and others have fled the country. So there are certainly Ukrainians that are against the war. There are Ukrainian Americans in the United States. Most of them are on the side of Zelensky and wanting to see a victory over Russia, but that is not all of them. I have met, as I've traveled around the country doing book talks, I've met Ukrainians along the way who are obviously very distraught by this war, but they are Russian speaking, their families are Russian speaking. They talk about the discrimination that their families have experienced in Ukraine. I have met Ukrainians from Crimea who feel that they have a historic connection to Russia, that they want to be part of Russia. So there is a great deal of differences among the Ukrainians in the United States, just as there are those differences in Ukraine as well, with the eastern part of the country in Crimea being historically more pro-Russian, and the western part being historically more pro-European.
One person asks, the big question would seem to be, where do we go from here?
Well, that certainly is the big question, and that's why I've been insisting that we have to go for negotiations, and what can we do to push that? Unfortunately, we don't have a way to push Putin, although I think that we can be talking to countries where we might have friends, like in South Africa, in Brazil, in Mexico, who do have access to Putin. But our access is to our own government and to the Europeans. And in that sense, we at Code Pink are part of a group called Peace in Ukraine. It's a coalition that you can join as an individual or as an organization. And if somebody could put the link in the chat, that would be great, peaceinukraine.org. And we have been working on several fronts. One is, how do we put pressure on our own representatives? And I saw in the chat that you have a meeting set up with Yvette Clarke coming up, which is great. I'd love to know what else you're doing about pushing Hakeem Jeffries. We are also working with our European allies, and there is a group called Europe for Peace. They have a website, europeforpeace.org. And we are very inspired by the connections that we have with them, because they have been getting out a lot more people in the streets than we have been able to get out. You don't hear about it much in the US press, but there have been large demonstrations in France, Italy, Germany, Czech Republic, and the UK. And as this war drags on and more people in Europe are affected by the inflation, the high costs of energy, the high costs of food, there will be more and more people in Europe protesting against their government's position. So in that sense, we can hook up with them to be a stronger force.
Okay, in relation to your comment, Brooklyn for Peace is trying to arrange meetings with other Brooklyn representatives, including Nydia Velasquez, Hakeem Jeffries, and the newly elected Daniel Goldman. And in fact, in our asks in a few minutes, we'll be asking people to get in touch with us if they're in any of those congressional districts and would like to join us in the meetings. So we are.
News.
Exactly
Thank
what,
you, Bruce.
and we'll continue to do so. Here. So
Can I just say that one of the problems in the meetings that we've been having is that there's no vehicle for these members of Congress who don't like to do something individually. They're like sheep, they want to be following. And because there isn't a letter right now coming from the Democratic side, there is the only ask that we have right now is that they say something individually in favor of peace talks, that they put out a statement, that they put out even a tweet, that they do something to show they're in favor of peace talks. Of course, if somebody had a little bit more of a spine, we would see a new letter coming out of the Congress calling for negotiations.
yeah, Matt Weinstein just put, we have Brooklyn for Peace has a petition calling for a ceasefire and negotiations. There's a link just been put in the chat. And so anybody who wants to sign that petition can just look in the chat and click on the link.
And you can ask your Congress people to support that petition.
Yes, I think, are we about out of time, or do we have time for another question or two? Anybody? Let me try one more.
We have 46 minutes.
We're going to 8:30.
No, we have 15 minutes.
I'm
but-
sorry, 15 minutes. We're at 7:40. I'm sorry, we had 7:46.
That's okay. Yes, we do have a few more minutes for some more questions.
Okay. This person asked if the U.S. claimed the right to encroach the sovereignty of Mexico to keep it from joining an alliance, would you support the U.S. government's position?
Well, I don't know what that means, because are we talking about military intervention? I mean, I'm against any kind of military intervention. I think that Mexico, let's be realistic, there is still 200 years now of the Monroe Doctrine. Mexico knows very well that it would not be tolerated by the United States to join any hostile military alliance.
Okay, let me go up. I've gotten a fair number.
But I do want to say that in Latin America now, China is the #1 trading partner for the continent. And this should be a lesson for the United States, that instead of putting all that money into the military and occupations, if we actually started producing more things that were useful for people, that we would have a much better foreign policy and be able to make a lot more friends around the world than we are doing right now.
Yeah. The latest question, wasn't that congressional letter right around election time? Maybe there should be another try before the Russian and Ukrainian offensives.
Well, I think this is a very critical question, an important one if we're going to end on that, because yes, when we have been going around to the offices, for example, we were recently in the office of Congressman Mark Pocan, who used to be the co-chair of the Progressive Caucus. He's from Madison, Wisconsin. And he said, yes, the timing of it was the problem, not the content. And so in that sense, yes, what we find is that there is not an appetite right now to go back into it, because it was such a damning experience for the members of the Progressive Caucus. But I do think that it is time for that. And maybe Ro Khanna is the person that could be pushing, since he has already come out for negotiations. But you are right. It was an issue of timing. And I think it is important for us to recognize that when you have a Democrat in the White House, it's harder for the Democrats to come out to oppose a policy than it is when there's a Republican in the White House. Were it Trump, I think we would have the progressives on our side. But when it comes to foreign policy issues, they're afraid of sticking their necks out, especially when they had such a horrible experience the last time around. But we've got to make it in their interest to do so, and that will only happen by a real groundswell from the bottom up.
Okay, I hope we can give a round of applause and thanks to Medea and also to all those folks who've come to listen and been so patient in listening. It appears pretty much everybody has stuck around, which I'm delighted to see. So if we can take a moment.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you. And I'm so glad you're taking the action now.
Yes,
Brava, brava.
and we're going to do two things. We're going to first have Michaela Zerkes, our executive director, say a word, and then Laura Castro is going to talk about what actions we're supporting and that people can take if they want to get involved. So Michaela, I'll turn it to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Bruce. And thank you, Medea, for that informative presentation and for outlining some of the possibilities for negotiations and diplomacy and encouraging all of us to take action toward that. So I want to take a moment to make a friendly request of folks here. If you found this forum informative and worthwhile, and if you leave here feeling empowered to take action for peace in Ukraine, we hope that you'll consider making even a modest donation to Brooklyn for Peace. Your contributions are what enable us to host forums like this with Medea and many other excellent speakers. And your financial support will also enable us to expand our local organizing and advocacy for a ceasefire and negotiations to end the war. We do need the funds to do this work effectively and to move us closer to achieving our larger goals of peace and justice. So if you're not yet a member of Brooklyn for Peace, we invite you to make a $35 annual membership donation, but whatever you can afford is very much welcome. So thank you to all of our past, present, and future supporters. And I will now pass it on to one of our newer but steadfast Brooklyn for Peace members, Laura Castro, to share some actions that we can take individually and collectively toward peace in Ukraine.
Thank you so much, Medea, as well. And it was so informative and a lot of inspiration for us. Some things that were mentioned with takeaways from this talk sound like they would include, and I suppose these are probably in the chat already, connecting to environmental groups, finding ways that all of these things connect and bringing in other movements to the peace movement. And it also sounds as if connecting to European groups might be very interesting in there. It was mentioned that europeforpeace.org might be something to connect to. Also, peaceinukraine.org, which we can connect to. And some people already may have. And did I leave anything out of that? Medea, did I leave anything out of some of the takeaways you mentioned for us?
I also wanted to put in the chat the 18-minute video that I did that I think is useful. People have been using in house parties, and also the book, War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless War, that many people have found useful not only for giving themselves more of a background and a ability to talk about this issue, but gifting it to relatives, co-workers, and others who they really feel need to see an alternative viewpoint.
Thank you so much. And thank you everybody who joined us tonight. I want to flag a few things. Our next forum is with Michael Clare on U.S. policy toward China on Thursday, March 2nd at 7:30 Eastern Standard Time via Zoom. The registration link will be available soon, so people should just stay tuned and sign up for Brooklyn for Peace newsletter for updates on that. And Michaela's going to drop the newsletter sign up link in the chat in case you don't have that. We're encouraging folks to join our program committee if they appreciate these forums and would like to be part of organizing them. Folks can email bfp@brooklynpeace.org, and I'm sure that can go into the chat too, if they're interested. And also very important, on February 25th, 12 noon to 1 p.m., we're going to hold a vigil under the arch at Grand Army Plaza in conjunction with the 1-year anniversary of this tragic war. For those who haven't attended them in the past, our vigils have been very inspirational, sometimes moving, and they're a great way to connect with the public. Again, thank you everybody so much for coming. Have I left anything out? Anybody who has something to note that I didn't mention? Okay.
One modest correction, the Michael Clare Forum is at 7
Oh,
p.m.
did I say something else? I wrote down 7 and I must have said something else. Sorry about that. Okay, 7
On March.
Eastern. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Again, thank everybody so much. Wishing you a good night and peace.